And let's move over to this story. A struggling economy piling retrenchments, and an airline facing constant turbulence, and a power giant that fails to guarantee reliable electricity supply. That's the South African story in a nutshell. But exactly what is it that Team SA, led by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, is selling at the World Economic Forum in Davos? SABC's Setho joins us from the freezing Switzerland. Good evening, Liabo, and welcome to The Full View. What exactly is this message that will be shared at the World Economic Forum, also taking into consideration that just ahead of the delegation leaving, we heard from the Reserve Bank downgrading the country's economic outlook?
Good evening, Aldrin. Yes, from the freezing Davos, but luckily we are much more warmer here in the media village, and what you want to know is that Team South Africa indeed is hell-bent and is very determined to sell South Africa as still an investment destination of choice. This is despite all the challenges that you have mentioned, the issue of SAA, the issue of Eskom, the issue of low growth environment, but we did earlier on speak to the acting CEO at Brand SA, who assured us that the SAA thing, it's not something that is quite new. This is probably part of the process that the business rescue practitioners are currently dealing with. And you also mentioned the issue of the IMF lowering its growth projections, obviously also not surprising, and also them flagging the issue of electricity supply as a constraint to growth. But it was during that press briefing, Aldrin, yesterday, that the IMF director actually praised most of the central banks for what she terms as loosening monetary policy. She actually says that most of the central banks have actually done so well in loosening monetary policy. And of course, we see that back home. Just last week, the Reserve Bank lowered interest rate by 0.25 percentage points. And with me, I have the governor of the Reserve Bank to find out where the headspace of the South African Reserve Bank is and where monetary policy for South Africa is heading to. Governor, thank you so much for making time to speak to the SABC.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, I've just told our viewers and Aldrin about, the rate cut. Is this indicative of monetary easing from the part of the South African Reserve Bank?
Well, the focus of monetary policy is always on our policy objective, and our policy objective is price stability. To the extent that we're confident that there is price stability, to the extent that we have got confidence that the inflation trajectory will be close to or be where we want it to be, which is at the midpoint of our target range, and this is sustained, it gives us a space to provide accommodation to the South African economy. We must also state, by the way, that as we were going into the Monetary Policy Committee last week, we were still of the view that the monetary policy stance was accommodative. So to put it, to sum it up, we were only able to provide further accommodation by reducing the policy rate because the inflation trajectory had improved, and inflation on a forward-looking basis shows that it is closer to 4.5%. But more importantly is that the expectations of price setters in the South African economy over the next 2 years are also closer to the 4.5%. And if we have inflation outcomes that are closer to the 4.5% or even lower than the 4.5%, hopefully it will fit into the price-setting behavior of the key actors in the South African economy.
Governor, let's talk about the comments that the Managing Director of the IMF mentioned yesterday, particularly with loosening of monetary policy globally as a whole. Do you agree with her?
Well, she is clearly occupying a different vantage point because she has got to be looking at what is happening across the globe. We process these things as well. And I can say to you, sitting in the International Monetary and Financing Committee of the IMF, that in our discourse, we said that the countries that have got monetary policy space or fiscal policy space, they must use it, especially in the case of the central banks if inflation is undershooting the targets. Many of the developed countries have got different issues to what we have. They are trying to generate inflation, whereas we are trying to manage inflation. It is closer to where we would want it to be, but it is important that it is sustained. And so what you will then find is that in the case of South Africa, the monetary policy space that we have is very limited. The Minister of Finance had stated that fiscal policy space doesn't exist, which means that for South Africa, in terms of the IMF's assessment, we fall in that category of countries where monetary policy space is limited, fiscal policy space does not exist, and we are left with the last pillar of the economic intervention package, which is that of structural reform. And I think that is why the National Treasury released this document that spelled out the structural reforms that South Africa needed to embark on. And one of the messages we are having to carry here in Davos is to demonstrate what progress has actually been made with the structural reforms. Some of the structural reforms might just look benign for South Africans, but they matter. South Africa has got excellent tourism assets, and in spite of our previous efforts where we made it difficult for tourists to come here, to come to South Africa, they still came. And now we have made it easier for tourists to come to South Africa through the relaxations of the visa regulations. We have seen that government talking about releasing spectrum. That is part of the structural reform programs, and the work that has been done from the Treasury side shows that these reforms, small as they might look like, actually would raise the growth potential of the South African economy.
Governor, I'm afraid we don't have much time, but I would really would love to explore more issues with regards to monetary policy in South Africa and in relation to the world. But I'm afraid this is all we have time for. I do thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aldrin, that is the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Mr. Lesetja Kganyago, giving us a perspective of, where monetary policy lay, and of course making reference to the messaging that they're sending to the to WEF and here in Davos with regard to structural reform. You remember that last week the Finance Minister had actually mentioned that he's expecting people to say that structural reform is quite slow, but something is happening nonetheless, and this should add somewhat to the conversation around South Africa. And with that, I'll hand over back to you in studio.
Well, thank you so much. Good economic assets and tourism assets, as you heard there from the governor. But the other question is, you have SAA on the other hand, and it's struggling.